Chapter 2, Cognitive, Language, and Literacy Development. We're really going to be talking about theories of literacy. Theories of learning. So organizing questions. What are Vygotsky and Piaget theories of human development? We're also going to look at Bronfenbrenner's theory of human development. What are ways you can set up your classroom to promote literacy development in young children? We'll touch on that slightly. And then what are the stages of learning and literacy? Language and literacy during the elementary and middle school years. We're going to really look at how is language and writing and everything developed. The main part of this chapter is Vygotsky and Piaget, and we will spend a great amount of time on that. I'm going to break this up. I would probably say that it's going to take, this is one of our longer chapters, so I'll break it up into different sections. So, how do kids develop cognitively? The term development really talks about how do you grow, adapt, change over the course of your lifetime. And we're going to look at the next couple chapters. First one we're going to look at is personality development. We're going to look at social emotional development next chapter. We're going to look at cognitive development, and we're going to look at language development. So the first two that we're going to look at is actually cognitive development, which is thinking, and then language development. So what do we have to really know? Why is this? Kids are not little miniature adults. A lot of times people like to think of them as little miniature adults, like they're just like pint size, but they're really not that. They actually see the world differently, and they look at the world differently. In your discussion board, I have you go look at some of the videos, and I want you to know those kids are all normal kids. There's nothing wrong with them. My students, when I do this in class, they always go, what's wrong with that kid? There's nothing wrong with them. It's just very natural to do this developmentally. And so one of the things that the first requirements to be able to work with children, whether you're going to be a teacher or whether you're going to be a parent, is to understand how children view the world differently than we do as adults. So effective teaching strategies or effective parenting strategies, you have to take into account the kids' ages and what they're doing. So some issues of development. There's probably two different developmental lenses that you can look at. We're looking at the nature and nurture controversy. Some people think you're just born that way. Are you born with a predisposition to be a serial killer, or is that nurtured in you? So most people would say that it's both. There was a while that there were a bunch of nature people. Matter of fact, the eugenics movement, which was we tried to breed better people, and then they tried to sterilize people who they thought were not of good genetic heritage or good stock. That would be a nature one, because they thought that they could breed out any imperfections. And then we have the nurture one, that you could take a perfectly normal child and put them in a bad situation and they would have difficulties. Or you could take a perfectly bad child, or crack babies are one that would be an instance of that. We have a lot of research that shows that children who were born from crack addicted mothers but then grew up in normal households have no residual side effects to the being born of someone who was on crack. So that would be a nurture argument. So most psychologists and most people now say that it's a little bit of both. There's a lot of nature and a lot of nurture. Actually, in some of our gene therapy now, we know that with genetics that you can be predetermined, or you can have a predestination or determination. What word am I looking for? Predisposition to being have like maybe schizophrenia, but if your gene does not turn on, you could have an environmental factor that turns on that gene, and then you can develop schizophrenia, because some identical twins, one will develop it and the other one will not. So we know that there's like a gene switch that can turn on a mutation or turn it off. So we know that there's a little nature and a little nurture. And then we also look at whether or not development proceeds in stages. We have the continuous and discontinuous theories. Continuous, think of environment. Discontinuous, think of hereditary. So, is development predetermined by first, hereditary or biological? Is it affected by experience? Most psychologists believe that nature and nurture are combined to influence the two. The second issue is continuous theory versus discontinuous theory. Continuous theory is that the information processing models assume that development occurs in smooth progression as skills develop and experiences are provided by caregivers and the environment. So they feel that if you were to leave a child alone, they wouldn't develop naturally or well, because this continuous theory of development assumes that your environment plays a large role in it. Discontinuous theory of development focuses on those inborn innate factors, and they don't really talk about environmental influences. They assume that the child progresses through a set of predictable and variant stages of development, and that all children develop the same skills in the same sequence. So Piaget believed that all children were born with an innate tendency to interact with and make sense of their environment. So in that way, if you went back, he would be a discontinuous theory, because he believed that there was just innate ability to do that. He actually talks about something called schemas. Schemas are not just in young children, all of us. We develop patterns of thinking, and they're called schemes. And the older you get, we deal with other objects in the world. We may have a schema. If I say tree right now, some of you are thinking of an oak tree. Some of you might be thinking of a palm tree. Some of you might be thinking of a flowering kind of a, like a pear tree or an apple tree or a cherry blossom. We all have these schemas of what comes to mind when we say something. And our schemas are built upon our actions. And so we actually use schemes to find out about and act on our world, because we have a predetermined notion of what we are experiencing. So if we look at this, banging is a favorite schema that babies use to explore their world. They'll bang everything. They'll take your car keys, they'll take glass, whatever. And Piaget believes that learning has to do with assimilation and accommodation. Assimilation occurs when you incorporate a new object into your scheme. So you're gonna bang a block, or you're gonna bang a spoon, or you're gonna bang somebody's phone. And all those things are kind of hard, and you get this idea that banging is not a big thing. But then you give a kid something like an egg, and it breaks. And then they look at you and they're like, you see that little confused look on their face, because it no longer fits in their schema. Everything else that they banged pretty much stayed the same. And then you give them something that doesn't stay the same, like an egg, and it breaks all over. Then they have to accommodate this new information. Then they figure out by trial and error that some things don't fit into the same schema. Same thing with small animals. If you have a dog in your house and you see a little baby, and you'll say to the baby, "What is that?" And then you'll say, "That's a doggy." And the baby you'll go, "Roof, roof, roof, doggy." And then you'll say, "Pet the doggy, nice doggy." And you'll pet him, and you'll say, "Soft doggy, feel the doggy's fur." And the dog will lick him, and you're like, "Oh, the doggy licks him. Yeah, doggy, doggy." And if the small child has only been around dogs, the first time they see a cat, they will call the cat a dog. And they'll say, "Doggy, doggy," and you say, "No, kitty, kitty." And then there's same thing. They're small, most of them are small. And then you'll pet them, and they have a nice soft fur. And then they might lick them, and then they feel that their tongue is rough. Or they might hear them, and it will go meow, 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 instead of the roof, roof, roof. So you're kind of teaching them the difference. So they're taking the concept, the schema of this small furry animal, or medium-sized furry animal, and they're taking that schema, and they assimilate, everything's the same. Hair, fur, soft, small, walks on four legs. They're assimilating all that. And then when they come up with something different, a different sound, like meow, meow, instead of roof, roof, then they have to accommodate that new information. And then they begin to develop a new schema based on the old schema of dog. And Piaget would say that that's learning. I'm going to take you to a little video real quick, because there's another part of Piaget's theory when he says that when they get into that idea, when they have to accommodate, they go through something called disequilibrium. Which cup do you want? The yellow cup? Why do you want the yellow cup?
It's bigger.
Show them both. And the yellow cup is bigger, right? Okay, now we're going to pour the juice in, and I want you to see which one's bigger, okay? Now, you think the yellow one's bigger, right?
Yeah.
Why?
Because the top is bigger.
The top is bigger? Okay. Okay, now, the one that you thought was bigger is full, right?
Yeah.
I want you to pour the one from the bigger cup, which is that one, to the other cup that's just kind of that he thinks is littler. Okay. You ready? Okay, you see that face right there? That face is disequilibrium, because he was really quite sure that he had a bigger cup that he was pouring into a smaller cup. So right now he had assimilate, and then he's got this theory, right? And it goes along with his schema that taller, when something is taller, means that there's something more, there's more in there. So if you see that face right there, that face is disequilibrium. He knows, viewing through his senses, that there's something wrong here, that it didn't turn out quite the way he thought it would. Which one's bigger? Which one is it? So you mean, and that one's still bigger? Because look, it's taller. Okay. On disequilibrium and concentration, actually on concentration, that I'm having you do on the discussion board. So you'll see a lot more of different things like this. But we're going to talk a little bit about that one, and I want to show you that one. So he's taken the taller cup and he's pouring it into a wider cup, and he's thinking that because it's taller, it's bigger. And that's because he can only focus on the one aspect at a time at this age. So that face that he had was called disequilibrium. When a kid's schema, when he has a hard time being able to assimilate new information and the schema has to change, you go through a process called disequilibrium. And your brain always wants to be in equilibrium. That's why when you're working on a problem, like in math or something like that, and you can't figure it out, and you keep like thinking about it and thinking about it and thinking about it, because the brain does not like to be in disequilibrium. It likes to, have everything figured out and copacetic. So Piaget actually put his theories into 4 major areas. And first one was sensorimotor. That's birth to age 2. And we're going to go into these again a little bit more. And that's that whole idea. The main part of this is object permanence. And that's moving from being reflective, which means using your reflexes. Like, we don't teach babies to cry. We don't teach them to suck. We don't teach them to grab or grasp onto a hand. They learn all that. They come kind of pre-wired with that. It's an innate ability. And then you go from preoperational stages, which is ages 2 to 7. So you're talking about preschool, early elementary here. They're just developing that idea to use symbols to represent objects and words. That's in their world, and words as well. Like, that's why letters and numbers, if you ever are around a little 2-year-old and stuff like that, they will switch numbers and letters around and stuff like that. And another big aspect of this is egocentric thinking, and they're very self-centered. 7 to 11 is concrete operational stage. And that's when they start to be able to think logically. They're starting to understand that A plus B equals C. They're starting to be able to put together 2 and 2 things. And they're also starting to be able to think from another person's point of view. So they're not so egocentric. They also have this idea of reversibility, which we're going to talk a little bit more about, but they can't abstract think yet from 7 to 11. They're having a very hard time doing hypotheticals or abstract thinking. When you get to formal operations from 11 to adulthood, you can do abstract thinking, and you can think purely symbolically. So you could definitely do, you can actually put yourself out there and think without thinking another realm. So you can do hypothetical situations all the time. And problems can be solved through systematic experimentation. It's like experimenting. Now, I'll go back and tell you that my little 4-year-old, that was my son when he was 4, and he did experiments to figure out his concentration of the juice box. He actually took that thing and measured it back and forth. He got a little measuring cup out and he drew a little marker on the line, and he would pour it in one and then he'd pour it back in the other. And he said to his little friends the next day, "It's not magic. I don't know how they do it, but I'm going to tell you right now, they are equal, and I don't know why." So he didn't understand the concept of volume yet, but he was able to assimilate to the point where he said, okay, I've got this accommodation. I understand they're equal, but I'm not really quite sure why they're equal. And it took him a little while, but he did through a lot of experimentation and play to be able to come to that conclusion, because other than that, he just thought that there was some kind of magic going on. So sensory to birth, excuse me. The earliest stage is called sensorimotor, and it's that baby stage, birth to age 2. from birth to about 8 months old, they're pretty much going by reflexes. They're starting to learn to interact with their environment, but pretty much everything is reflexes. If you're ever around a little tiny baby and they're trying to suck their thumb, it's trial and error. That's why they poke themselves in the eye. That's why you got to put those little mittens on them, because they're trying to get that thumb in their mouth, but they're not usually succeeding. But through trial and error, they usually get it, and then it becomes purposeful activities where they're actually trying to do that. And that's that idea of object permanence. Object permanence is the hallmark of that stage. This is the granddaddy of the stage, because what they start to begin to realize is that when they are not viewing an object, it is still there. One of the videos that you guys will look at in the discussion board is about a little baby and how mom and dads play peekaboo and stuff with them. That's why if you've ever been around a little kid, you can actually, if they can't see you, you can't see them, according to them. They'll close their eyes and they're like, you can't see me, I'm hiding. And you're like, really? You're right there. But they don't understand that an object exists when it's out of sight. And so it takes them a little while to get to that point of real object permanence that goes along with that idea that the world exists when I'm not looking at it. That preoperational stage 2 to 7, the biggest parts of this is conservation and centration. And that's because kids can start to think mentally. They can mentally represent objects in their brain. So they can start to count. Up until this point, up until after age 2, they have the idea that there's a one-on-one correspondence between one thing and the idea of numbers. Think about that. Those are two different things. That this is an object, and be able to count the objects makes it hard. So one of his big discoveries at this time was that kids couldn't understand volume and height at the same time. So the example they give here is that objects has weight remains the same, but it could change its property of length. So one of the things that they'll do a lot of times is they'll take a ball of clay and they'll show it to them in a circle, and right in front of the kid's eyes you will rub that ball of clay and make it into like a snake, a really long thing, and you'll ask them, like, do you think that the snake or the ball weighs more? And they'll usually tell you the ball, or they might tell you the snake, or which one's bigger. They will always tell you the bigger is the snake, even though they've just actually seen that the ball being made into the snake. There's a great example in the videos of a little girl with quarters, and they line the quarters up 5 and 5, and when they're perfectly lined up, she counts them, and she says they're 5 and they're 5, they're the same. And then right in front of a little girl, they spread those little quarters out, and then they ask them, are they the same or are they different? Which one has more is what they ask her. And she will say the top one has more because it's longer. So that's that idea that goes along with conservation, is the idea of centration, which is they can only pay attention to one aspect of the object or the situation at a time. So children pay attention to the length of the row of blocks rather than the actual number of blocks. But if the length is the same, then they will switch to numbers, but they can't do number and length at the same time. I like this poem. It was cute. My dad gave me a $1 bill because I'm his smarter son, and I swapped it for 2 shiny quarters because 2 is more than 1. And then I took the quarters and traded them to Lou for 3 dimes. I guess he didn't know that 3 is more than 2. Just then along came old Blind Bates, and just 'cause he can't see, he gave me 4 nickels for my 3 dimes, and 4 is more than 3. And then I took the nickels to Heron Combs down at the seed feed store, and the fool gave me 5 pennies for them, and 5 is more than 4. And then I went back, and I went and showed my dad, and he got red in the cheeks and closed his eyes and shook his head, too proud of me to speak. And this is one of those reasons why you can always fool little kids. You know, you got 2 cookies and they've got 1 cookie, and they start complaining because you've got 2 cookies and they got 1, and you break their cookie in half and you say, now you have 2 cookies, and they go, oh, okay, thank you. Little kids cannot focus on more than one state at once. And right now in this Shel Silverstein poem, you know, he is focusing on the idea of number, not on the idea of value of money. The next one part of preoperational stage continued is reversibility. And that's the ability to change directions in one's thinking, to return to that starting point. So kids can't usually go back. If you think of it in behavior, they always can't tell you what caused the behavior beforehand because they have a difficult time going backwards in time. They can't reverse their thinking. They can mentally reverse the process of pouring milk and realize that if the milk were poured back into a tall beaker, its quantity would not change. So they have a hard time realizing that. They also are very egocentric. My daughter used to always say to me, she'd put her hand on my head and on her head, and she would say, "Do you feel my headache, Mommy? Do you feel my headache?" And I would say, "No, baby, I'm sorry, I can't feel your headache." And she'd go, "But it hurts so much. You gotta feel it. It's pounding, Mommy. It's right there. It's pounding." And I would think, and she could not understand that I couldn't feel what she was feeling, because in their eyes, the world is viewed through whatever they see. So if they can't see you, you can't see them. If they my daughter would put her hand up in front of my eyes, so that she would think that she couldn't see my eyes, and then she'd say, "Are you mad that you can't see the TV, Mommy?" And I'd be like looking right over her hand, and I'd go, "Yep, honey, I'm really upset," because in their life, the world is only seen through their eyes, and that's also why small children from 2 to 7 or 2 to 5 typically. 5 years is usually when egocentricity starts to fade away, a little after 5. But it can go all the way up to 7. They will, when they say, "I want it, therefore it should be mine," because the world is only viewed through their eyes. That's why sharing and such is a very difficult concept for small children. You could teach it to them, but they really don't understand why until later. So, for example, when children is one side of a display of 3 mountains, when asked to describe the scene looked at and a doll seated on the other side, the children below the age of 6 or 7 describe the doll's view as identical to their own. So they cannot see from another person's perspective. So if you say things like, "How would Johnny feel?" they would have no idea how Johnny would feel. They will tell you how they would feel. And right now, if they're mad, they're just going to say mad. So concrete operational stages, the other part of it that goes along with it, that although the mental abilities of pre-operational students in concrete operational elementary schools are dramatic, they really don't think like adults. They are more concrete, if you think of it that way. They have to actually see something going on. They're starting to be able to do that inferred reality, or they're starting to be able to think from another person's perspective, but they really can't abstract to that point where they can do hypotheticals. So they're starting to get that capacity for logical reasoning, but they only can do it in familiar situations. They can't completely imagine something that would be totally out there, unless it's something based on something familiar to them. So inferred reality is actually the hallmark of this stage, and its ability to see things in the context of other meanings. Our text gives an example of showing a picture of a red car and then covering it with a black film. And a child who's mastered this inferred reality still knows that the car is red. So a lot of times kids will not be able to do that. They actually can't imagine or think through this whole kind of thing. That's why reading is really important at this age too, because reading helps them, by description, helps them begin to be able to see realities of different people or at different times, and it begins to infer reality. Another part of this concrete operational stage that is an important part is ceration, and that's the importance of a task that a child learns to be able to arrange things in a logical progression. So if you really think about this, counting is ceration. So there's going to be some children, even though they can master it maybe in kindergarten where they're starting to count to 100 and stuff, they don't really totally grasp that idea of it until they have ceration. And they also have to have the ability of being able to look at lining up sticks from smallest to largest. That goes along with that. And then once they have that ability, then they usually can start to master transivity, which is that idea where kids can mentally arrange and compare objects. They can, it can be transient. They can move one object from one area and then compare it to another object. And they can kind of do this all mentally, where they can move things around and make comparisons. So by the end of this stage, the students should be able to have the mental abilities to add, subtract, multiply, divide, and place numbers in any order, and be able to classify objects by the number of criteria. This is really important to think about. Reversibility and transitivity. These are all mathematical concepts, but that idea, remember when your teachers used to say like 5 plus 7 equals 12, and then they would say 12 minus 5 equals 7, and they'd say you could check your answer. But most kids don't understand that idea of reversibility, that you can reverse that. They just were like, wow, that's kind of a cool trick. They didn't mentally understand the concept that went along with that. When we get to formal operational stage, sometimes around the onset of puberty, actually there's been studies that show that it actually doesn't happen sometimes until like your 20s. And some people would argue that some people never reach formal operation stage. Children thinking begin to develop in the form of a characteristic of more adult-like. They can start to think abstractly. They can do hypotheticals. They can see possibilities beyond the here and now. They can start to project where they're going to be or what's going to happen. And these abilities continue to develop. They get to deal with that potential, or as I said, hypothetical. And the form is now separate from the context. They don't have to read about it or have it right there with them. It doesn't have to be something that's concrete to them. It can be totally abstract. That's why I say some people, they say doesn't, it never happens to, because if you've ever met somebody, you'll say, but hypothetically, we could do X, Y, and Z, and they'll go, well, I would never do that. And you go, yeah, I know you'd never do that, but just like hypothetically, like just pretend you could do that, but I would never do that. And you're like, yeah, I realize you probably would never do that, but could you just imagine that you could do that? And they're like, no, I can't even imagine that. And so when you do that kind of stuff and then you realize that they're not quite at the formal operational stage. I don't know why I keep saying observation. Another ability that Piaget recognized in young adolescents was the ability to reason about situations and conditions that they haven't experienced. And that's when we're talking about hypothetical. Like they can, a lot of kids get like the fear aspect of this, like they can imagine that they would be abducted and all this kind of stuff. Now, younger children, this is one of the criticisms that we're going to get to on Piaget, is some of the younger children can do that as well. So that's why a lot of the opponents of Piaget's theory say, wait a minute, I've seen 7-year-olds do this, or I've seen 8-year-olds. So there is some fluidity between his stages, but these are kind of like general guidelines that you go through. So one of the things that your book talks about in Figure 2.3 is that problem-solving ability. You really don't really get to that until the kids get, when they're in the concrete operational stage, they'll take the problem less systematically than kids who have entered the formal operations. They don't really start to, because they're still not focusing completely on all the aspects of it. They may think logically, but they haven't thought about all the different aspects that go along with it. And the reason that actually happens when we talk about a swing and a pendulum swing is the longer the string's length affects the frequency. So as I said just a minute ago, some of the criticisms and revisions of Piaget's theory is that some of these tasks can be taught earlier. If you talk to children or work with children, there's Marie Montessori's programs are based a lot on Piagetian principles and Vygotskian principles, and so we know that some of those kids actually do things a little bit earlier. There are exceptions to egocentricity. Some people argue that every time that you go through a social emotional stage that we tend to become egocentric, that when we're under stress, we tend to become egocentric. We start to look at the world only through our own eyes. There are newer research on mastery of object permanence. They say that even small infants, they've measured how long their eyes focus, like on their parents and stuff like that, or maybe on a bottle, and they realize that object permanence, they typically would say that it didn't show up until about age 8 months, but now they've even seen it as early as 4 months. And they do know that development is influenced by experience. If you put a kid just in a playpen and don't ever let them out of the playpen, and they don't interact with their environment, they're not going to develop those Piagetian stages as quickly as someone who has more interactive time with their environment. So when we look at theory into practice, we want to talk about developmentally appropriate education. Like right now we're teaching little kindergartners, like their numbers, and we're teaching them it's okay to work on one-on-one correspondence, but we used to teach like to 100, and now we've kind of focused on just to 20 in the kindergarten age, but even still, that's kind of a hard concept to be able to relate to. We're also teaching reading at a much earlier level, like at 4 and 5. And for some children, that might come with language naturally. But for other children who are still having the idea of symbolism, understanding that a letter makes a sound, is hard for some children developmentally to understand. So we have to recognize that children have to be self-initiated, and they have to have active involvement in their learning. We just can't just be skill and drilling them. They have to create what they're doing and interact with it, because that's why Piaget and Vygotsky both are constructivists. They think that children construct knowledge. So we have de-emphasis on practices aimed at making children adult-like in their thinking. We can't keep pushing the curriculum down farther because developmentally they're just not ready for it. And there are children. There are going to be 7-year-olds that are still going to be struggling with things that some 4-year-olds have mastered, because there are individual differences in children's developmental processes.